The morning Annie Monroe walked into the Dusty Creek land office with nothing but a handwritten deed, a borrowed pen, and 3 lawyers standing between her and everything her husband had died to build. The whole town held its breath. It was the spring of 1882, and the territory of New Mexico was not a place known for mercy. Dusty Creek sat at the crossroads of 2 cattle trails, a sunbaked settlement of maybe 400 souls who had come west looking for something worth keeping. Some had found it, others had found only dust and disappointment. Annie Monroe had found love, built a life, and then watched a fever take her husband Daniel in the cold February of that same year, leaving her with 60 acres of good grazing land, a 2-room homestead, a milk cow named Pearl, and 3 men who wanted every inch of it. She was 28 years old. Her hair was the dark brown of creek water in shadow, and her eyes were the clear amber of late afternoon light through a jar of honey. She was not a small woman in spirit, though she stood only a few inches above the average height, and she carried herself with the quiet, steady weight of someone who had learned early that the world was not going to hand her anything she did not reach for herself. Daniel Monroe had loved that about her. He had told her so, right up until the last week when talking took more out of him than he had to spare. The deed was the problem. When Daniel had purchased the land 4 years prior, in the autumn of 1878, he had done so through a man named Harlan Voss, who was at that time the most prominent attorney in Dusty Creek. Voss had drawn up the paperwork himself, recorded it in the county ledger, and charged Daniel $40 for the service. Daniel had paid it, taken his copy of the deed, and ridden home to the woman he planned to build a life with. What Daniel had not known, and what Annie only discovered after his burial, was that Voss had filed the deed with a subtle but legally significant error. The deed listed the land as the property of Daniel Monroe, singular, with no mention of Annie as joint owner or as beneficiary. Under the laws of the New Mexico Territory in 1882, this created a situation that 3 lawyers were now very eager to exploit. Harlan Voss was the first of the 3. He was a thick man in his 50s with white sideburns and small eyes that moved quickly, taking stock of everything, and everyone in a room the way a merchant takes stock of inventory. He had approached Annie 3 days after Daniel's funeral with a sympathetic expression and a document she had not asked for, suggesting that since the deed was solely in Daniel's name, the property would need to go through a formal estate proceeding, and that he would be happy to represent the estate for a modest fee. Annie had asked what fee. Voss had told her it was not modest. She had shown him the door. The second lawyer was a younger man named Preston Cole, who had ridden into Dusty Creek the previous year and set up an office with a painted sign and a lot of confidence. Cole had gotten wind of the estate situation through Voss, because the 2 of them had an arrangement that was not publicly discussed, but was understood by most of the town's more observant residents. Cole had come to Annie with a different approach, suggesting that the property would likely be contested by the territory on the grounds that a widow with no recorded claim had no legal standing to hold the land, and that he could navigate the process for her in exchange for 20% of the property's assessed value. 20% of 60 acres of good New Mexico grazing land in 1882 was not nothing. Annie had shown Cole the door as well, though with somewhat less patience than she had shown Voss. The third lawyer was a man named Douglas Whitmore, who did not practice in Dusty Creek, but had been brought in from the county seat at San Cristobal. Whitmore represented a land-holding company called Western Territorial Properties, which had been quietly acquiring land throughout the region for 2 years. Whitmore was the most dangerous of the 3 because he was the most capable. He was lean and sharp-featured, perhaps 40 years of age, with a manner that was almost courteous and eyes that were not. He had come to Annie with a purchase offer. It was not a bad offer as offers went. It was also not a fair one, and Annie had recognized it for what it was. The kind of offer made by a man who is already certain he holds the winning hand and is offering you the chance to fold before he plays it. Annie had not folded. What she had done instead was spend every evening for 3 weeks sitting at the table where she and Daniel had eaten their meals, reading the deed, and every piece of paper she could find relating to New Mexico territorial land law. She had written to the county clerk's office in San Cristobal. She had written to a land law pamphlet publisher in Santa Fe. She had read until her eyes ached and the candle burned down to nothing, and then she had lit another one and kept reading. What she found, buried in the language of the New Mexico Territorial Land Act of 1877, was a provision that allowed a surviving spouse to file a corrective deed affirming joint occupancy and use of property when the original deed contained a clerical or administrative error that failed to reflect the actual circumstances of ownership. The provision was not widely known. It had been included at the insistence of a territorial legislator from the Southern District who had watched his own mother lose her home to a similar technicality, and it had sat in the statutes ever since, largely overlooked. Annie had read it 4 times to make certain she understood it, and then she had read it twice more for good measure. The provision required the surviving spouse to appear in person at the county land office, present evidence of the error and of the spousal relationship, and file a corrective deed in the presence of a witness and a land office clerk. It could not be done through an attorney. It had to be done by the claimant herself. Annie had spent 2 more days preparing her documents. She gathered every piece of paper she and Daniel had accumulated. Their marriage certificate from 1878, letters Daniel had written to her that mentioned the land and referred to it as theirs, receipts from the general store showing that she had purchased supplies for the homestead, a signed statement from their neighbor Clement Brady, who had helped them build the fence along the eastern boundary, and could attest to Annie's continuous residence and work on the property. She organized everything in a leather satchel that had been Daniel's, and on a Thursday morning in late April, she put on her best dress, hitched Pearl's companion, a sturdy brown horse named Copper, to the wagon, and drove the 6 miles into Dusty Creek. She had not expected the lawyers to be waiting. Voss was standing on the boardwalk outside the land office. Cole was beside him. Whitmore stood a few feet apart, which was the physical expression of his professional relationship to the other 2, adjacent in interest, separate in presentation. There were also 2 men with them who were not lawyers, broad-shouldered men with the look of hired purpose, and the sight of them made something cold and deliberate settle into Annie's chest. She brought the wagon to a stop and sat for a moment, hands in her lap, looking at the land office door and then at the men in front of it. The street was not empty. It was nearly 10 in the morning, and Dusty Creek's main thoroughfare had its usual traffic: a feed wagon, 2 women with market baskets, an old man on a mule, and a handful of cowboys who had come into town from one of the surrounding ranches for supplies and general sociability. One of those cowboys was Thomas Sawyer. He was 32 years old, tall in the way that ranges of country are tall, with a quality of unhurried breadth to him that spoke of open space lived in rather than merely passed through. He had dark eyes under the brim of a well-worn hat, and a jaw that held a certain quiet stubbornness in the set of it. He worked for the Rafter Cross ranch, 10 miles north of Dusty Creek, and he had been in town since the previous afternoon, having ridden in with 2 other hands to pick up a load of fence wire and attend to the kind of small errands that accumulate when you spend most of your life on the range. He had gotten the wire loaded that morning and was crossing the street toward the dry goods store when he noticed the widow Monroe's wagon, and then noticed the 3 lawyers and their companions arranged between her and the land office door. Thomas Sawyer had been in Dusty Creek long enough to know who Annie Monroe was, at least in the way you know someone in a small settlement. He had known Daniel Monroe by sight and by reputation, the way most men in the region knew their neighbors, Not intimately, but with the basic familiar respect of people who share the same difficult land. He had heard about the fever and the death and the trouble with the deed, because in a town the size of Dusty Creek, trouble with land and lawyers was the kind of news that traveled without needing to be carried. He had thought about it with the passing sympathy of someone not directly involved, and then he had gone back to his work. But standing in the street with his hat brim throwing shadow across his eyes, watching Annie Monroe sit alone on that wagon seat with a leather satchel in her hands and 3 lawyers blocking her path, Thomas Sawyer found that his sympathy was less passing than he had supposed. He crossed the street, not in a hurry, not with any particular display. He just walked across the main street of Dusty Creek with the same long, easy stride he used to cover ground on the range, and he came to a stop beside the wagon. Annie looked down at him. She had seen him before in the peripheral way that you see familiar faces in a small town, enough to know he rode for the Rafter Cross, not enough to have exchanged more than the occasional nod of acknowledgement. Up close, the steadiness in his face was more pronounced, and she found it oddly steadying in return. "Mrs. Monroe," he said. "Mr. Sawyer," she said. He looked at the lawyers on the boardwalk and then looked back at her. "You headed into the land office." "I am," she said. "You mind if I walk with you?" She considered him for a moment, not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful consideration of a woman who had spent 3 weeks reading land law by candlelight and was not inclined to take anything at face value. What she saw in his face was not calculation. It was something plainer and more reliable than that. It was simple human decency taking the trouble to show up. "I would not mind that at all," she said. She climbed down from the wagon without assistance, not out of pride but because she was accustomed to managing on her own, and Thomas walked beside her as she crossed the boardwalk toward the land office. Voss stepped slightly to one side. Cole held his ground for a moment and then thought better of it. The 2 broad-shouldered companions shifted, and Thomas looked at them with an expression that communicated nothing threatening and everything necessary, and they did not move further. Whitmore was the one who spoke. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, in that almost courteous voice of his, "I would strongly advise against proceeding without legal representation. What you're attempting this morning is likely to complicate matters considerably." Annie stopped. She turned to face him with the full weight of 3 weeks of lamplight reading and a lifetime of not being talked into corners. "What I'm attempting this morning, Mr. Whitmore," she said clearly, "is filing a corrective deed under Section 14 of the New Mexico Territorial Land Act of 1877. I don't require a lawyer to do it. I require a clerk, a witness, and a pen." Something shifted in Whitmore's expression. Not surprise quite, but the recalibration of a man who has miscalculated and knows it. Voss's face reddened slightly. Cole looked at the ground. Thomas Sawyer opened the door to the land office. The clerk was a young man named George Avery, who had the look of someone who spent most of his time hoping that nothing complicated would happen in his office. Something complicated had clearly arrived, and he stood behind his counter with the expression of a man trying to determine which direction the current was running before committing to a stroke. Annie placed her satchel on the counter, opened it, and began laying out her documents with the methodical calm of someone who has organized their evidence very carefully and knows exactly where everything is. The marriage certificate, the letters, the receipts, Clement Brady's signed statement, and the deed itself, Daniel's copy, with the error circled in careful ink. "I need to file a corrective deed," she said to George Avery, "under Section 14 of the Territorial Land Act of 1877. George Avery stared at the documents. He was, it was apparent, not entirely certain that he had ever processed a corrective deed under Section 14 of the Territorial Land Act of 1877. He was also not entirely certain that he had not. "I'll need to check the procedural requirements," he said, in the voice of a man buying time. "I have them here," Annie said, and placed a hand-copied page of the relevant statutory language on the counter. She had copied it herself from the pamphlet she had received from Santa Fe in her own careful handwriting. George Avery looked at the statutory language. He looked at the documents. He looked at Annie. He looked at Thomas Sawyer, who was standing against the wall with his arms folded in the manner of a man who has no particular interest in interrupting but very considerable interest in the outcome. Harlan Voss had followed them inside. "Now see here, Avery," he said, in the tone of a man accustomed to being the largest presence in any room involving legal proceedings. "This woman has no standing to file anything without proper representation. The deed is clearly in her late husband's name, and until the estate is properly administered—" "Mr. Voss," Annie said, without raising her voice, "the deed is in my late husband's name due to a clerical error at the time of filing. The law I have cited exists precisely to correct that kind of error. If you have a legal objection, you're welcome to file it after the deed is recorded. The statutory language does not require your approval before it can be submitted." George Avery was reading the hand-copied statutory language. He read it once. He read it again. His expression resolved from uncertainty into something more solid. "She's right, Mr. Voss," he said, and there was a small note of relief in his voice, the relief of a man who has found the answer clearly written down and does not have to make a judgment call. Section 14 allows a corrective deed to be filed by the claimant directly. "I need to record it and have it signed in the presence of a witness." Voss's face was fully red now. "This is highly irregular," he said. "The language is clear," George Avery said, and there was in him in that moment a small but genuine dignity that clearly surprised him as much as anyone. Thomas pushed off from the wall. "I'll be the witness," he said. Everyone looked at him. He met each set of eyes in turn with the unhurried directness of a man who has made a decision and is entirely comfortable with it. Preston Cole stepped forward. "You have no standing here," he said to Thomas. "You're a ranch hand. You're not a party to any of this." "I don't need standing," Thomas said. "I need to be present and willing to sign. The law doesn't say the witness has to be a lawyer." He looked at George Avery. "Does it?" George Avery checked the statutory language again. "No," he said. "It just needs to be an adult citizen." Thomas Sawyer looked at Preston Cole. Cole said nothing further. Annie filled out the corrective deed form that George Avery produced from a drawer. Her handwriting was clear and steady, the handwriting of a woman who had taught herself to write well, because she had understood early that words on paper had power. She wrote her name alongside Daniel's on the corrected deed, listed the property description from the original document, cited the statutory authority for the correction, and attached her supporting documents as required. Her hand did not shake, not once. When she was finished, she looked up at George Avery. He stamped the deed with the county seal, recorded it in the ledger with a date and reference number, and then looked at Thomas Sawyer. Thomas took the pen from George's hand. He looked at Annie before he signed. She was watching him with those clear amber eyes, and there was something in them that went beyond gratitude, something that had not yet found its name but was already looking for one. He held her gaze for a moment that stretched a little longer than formality required, and then he set the pen to the paper and signed his name as witness. He handed the pen back to George Avery. Harlan Voss turned and walked out of the land office. Preston Cole followed him. Douglas Whitmore remained for a moment, looking at the recorded deed with the expression of a man updating his calculations. And then he nodded once, a small, precise acknowledgement, and left without a word. The two broad-shouldered men outside had already gone. Annie stood at the counter with the stamped, recorded corrective deed in her hands. 60 acres of New Mexico grazing land, clearly and legally in her name. Daniel's name was there too, because that was right and proper, because the land had always been theirs together, but now the record showed what had always been true. She held the deed for a long moment, feeling the weight of it, which was not the weight of paper but the weight of everything it represented. 3 weeks of reading by candlelight, 4 years of building a life, a marriage that a fever had ended too soon, and a piece of ground that she was going to keep. "Well," she said, and her voice was steady but her eyes were bright. "That is done." Thomas was watching her from across the small room. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was something in his voice that he was not quite ready to put more specific words to. He had been in that land office for perhaps 40 minutes, and he was not entirely certain he had ever spent 40 minutes that felt more worthwhile. George Avery cleared his throat. "Mrs. Monroe, you should know that Whitmore or one of the others might try to contest the filing through the circuit court. You have 30 days to—" "I know," Annie said. "The statutory provision includes a 30-day contestation window. I'll be ready for it." She looked at George Avery with a directness that made him stand a little straighter. "Thank you for doing your job properly this morning." George Avery stood straighter still. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and meant it. Outside, the main street of Dusty Creek had resumed its normal business, but with a slightly charged quality to it, the way air feels after lightning has passed through. Several people had observed what had happened on the boardwalk, and word was already moving through the settlement in the way that significant things move in small towns, with speed and considerable decoration. Annie stepped out onto the boardwalk and stood in the spring sunlight with the deed in her satchel. Thomas came out beside her and stood for a moment, tilting his hat back slightly and looking up and down the street. "Can I buy you a cup of coffee, Mrs. Monroe?" he asked. She looked at him. "You already did more than that," she said. "But yes." They walked down to the Dusty Creek dining room, which was the town's only proper eating establishment, run by a woman named Rosa Sandoval who had come up from the South 12 years prior and made the best biscuits in the territory. Rosa poured their coffee without being asked, because she had been watching from her window and had a clear idea of what the morning had required. They sat across from each other at a table near the window, and for a little while neither of them said much, which was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of two people who have been through something together and are still settling into the aftermath. "Where did you find that law?" Thomas asked eventually. "I wrote to Santa Fe," Annie said, "to a pamphlet publisher, and I read everything Daniel had from when he bought the land. I knew there had to be something. A law that let people fix mistakes. It seemed too unreasonable otherwise." "It would have been unreasonable," he agreed. "A great deal of what gets done to people is unreasonable," she said. "It doesn't stop it from happening. But sometimes there's a provision buried somewhere that says it can be undone." She looked at her coffee. "I had to find it myself. No one was going to find it for me." Thomas looked at her across the table. The morning light through the window caught the planes of her face and the steadiness of her expression, and he felt something move in his chest that he recognized, having felt it before a long time ago and then not felt it for quite some time after. It was the particular recognition of meeting someone who impresses you in a way that goes past admiration into something more personal. "I've been in this part of the territory for 8 years, he said. "I have never seen anyone do what you did in there this morning." "I filed a deed," she said. "You walked into a room with 3 lawyers and 2 men they'd hired to make you uncomfortable," he said, "and you laid out your case from memory, cited the statute by number, and didn't let any of them rattle you. And you did all of it in about 40 minutes. He paused. "That is not filing a deed. That is something considerably more." Annie was quiet for a moment. She was not a person who deflected compliments with false modesty, but she was also not a person who was entirely accustomed to being seen so precisely. "Daniel used to say I was stubborn," she said. "I prefer thorough." "He was right about the stubborn part," Thomas said, "but stubborn isn't the word I choose." "What word would you choose?" He thought about it. "Decided," he said, "like someone who has thought something all the way through and arrived somewhere solid." She looked at him with those amber eyes, and the looking lasted a beat longer than polite conversation required. "That is a good word," she said. They finished their coffee. Rosa Sandoval refilled their cups without being asked again, because she was a perceptive woman, and because she felt that the morning warranted it. Thomas asked Annie about the land, about what she was planning to do with 60 acres on her own, and she told him about the cattle she had, a small herd of 7, and the garden. and the way the eastern pasture would support more grazing if the fence were extended another quarter-mile. She spoke about the land the way people speak about things they love, with detail and without self-consciousness, and Thomas listened the way he listened to country, with full attention and genuine interest. He told her about the Rafter Cross, about the work and the land and the particular satisfaction of a job done well in open country. He was not a man who talked about himself easily, but with Annie he found the words came without the usual effort, and he was aware of this in the way you are aware of a change in weather, a notable difference in the quality of the air. When they finally rose to leave, Thomas walked her back to her wagon. The street had gone about its afternoon business, and the weight of the morning's confrontation had settled into something that was already becoming the town's newest piece of collective memory. "Thank you," Annie said, standing beside Copper with the reins in her hand. "For the witness signature, you didn't have to do that." "No," he said, "I didn't have to." She looked at him. He looked at her. The New Mexico spring air was warm and smelled of dust and distant sage, and the moment had a particular quality to it that both of them noted without yet knowing what to do with. "I'll be watching the 30-day window," she said, "in case Whitmore decides to contest." "You'll handle it," he said. "I know," she said, not with arrogance, with the simple certainty of someone who has been tested and knows what she is made of. She climbed up onto the wagon seat, gathered the reins, and looked down at him. "If you're ever out along the Copper Creek Road," she said, "the Monroe place is the one with the red barn." "I know which one it is," he said. She nodded. And then she drove away down the main street of Dusty Creek in the warm April light, and Thomas Sawyer stood and watched until the wagon was out of sight, and then stood for a moment longer, and then went to collect the fence wire and ride back to the Rafter Cross. He thought about her the entire 10 miles home. The 30-day contestation window passed without a formal challenge from Douglas Whitmore, which surprised some people and surprised Annie not at all. She had done her reading carefully enough to know that the statutory provision was clear, that her documentation was thorough, and that a challenge would require Whitmore to argue against language that left very little room for interpretation. He was a capable lawyer, but he was also a practical one, and practical men do not spend money fighting battles that the law has already decided. Western Territorial Properties moved on to other acquisitions, and Harlan Voss avoided Annie Monroe's gaze on the street for the better part of a year. What did surprise Annie was the knock on her door on a Saturday afternoon in early May, about 2 weeks after the land office. She opened it to find Thomas Sawyer standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and a somewhat careful expression on his face, the expression of a man who has thought about what he is doing and arrived deliberately at the doing of it. "I was in the area," he said. She looked at him. The Rafter Cross was 10 miles north. He was standing at her door on a Saturday with no visible errand. "You were in the area," she said. "More or less," he said, and there was the faintest shift of something in his expression that was not quite a smile but was related to one. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I just made coffee." He came in and sat at the table where she and Daniel had eaten their meals and where she had read land law by candlelight for 3 weeks, and she poured the coffee and sat across from him, and they talked for 2 hours. About the land, about the cattle market, about a book she had been reading, about the way the light moved across the eastern pasture at the end of the day, about what it was like to be far from wherever you had started, and whether that was a loss or a freedom, or whether, in the right circumstances, it could be both. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. By the 3rd Saturday, they had fallen into a rhythm that had the comfortable inevitability of things that are right in the way that good ground is right, in the way that the eastern pasture was right for grazing, and the garden was right for the particular quality of the soil and the angle of the morning sun. They walked the fence line together that 3rd Saturday, because she had mentioned the quarter-mile extension she was planning, and he had a good eye for terrain and where posts ought to go, and the conversation about fence posts and pasture grass moved naturally, and without effort into conversation about other things, larger things, things that neither of them had talked about easily with anyone in a long time. He told her about a woman he had known in Texas, 8 years ago, before he had come to New Mexico. Not with grief, but with the plain honesty of someone laying out the map of their life, so that another person can read it without confusion. Her name had been Clara, and she had married someone else while Thomas was away on a cattle drive that had taken longer than expected, and he had come home to find the wedding already done, and the story already over. He had come to New Mexico partly because of the land work, and partly because the change of territory had felt necessary. Annie told him about Daniel. Not with the recitation of someone performing grief, but with the genuine remembrance of someone who had loved a person, and was still in the process of understanding what it meant to continue living after them. She told him about the 4 years, the building of the homestead, the small daily life of two people making something together, and the fever that had taken him in February with an abruptness that still caught her sideways sometimes, at odd moments, when the light was the right angle or she heard a sound he would have commented on. Thomas listened with the full attention she had noticed in the land office, the kind of attention that feels like being held steady rather than being observed, and she was grateful for it. "He would have hated those lawyers," she said at one point. "He would," Thomas agreed, "though from what you've told me, he would have liked watching you dismantle them." She laughed. It was the first real laugh she had had in a long time, and it surprised her with how good it felt, the simple physical fact of laughing on a spring afternoon while walking a fence line she intended to extend. Thomas looked at her when she laughed. He did not say anything, but his eyes had a warmth in them that had not been there in quite that particular way before, and she noticed it the way you notice a change in light, which is to say immediately, and with the full sensory attention of your body before your mind has finished processing it. By the end of May, he was coming every week. By the middle of June, he was sometimes coming twice. He had helped her with the fence extension, bringing a post driver from the Rafter Cross one Sunday morning, and spending the day driving posts into the hard New Mexico earth with a steady, tireless energy, while Annie followed behind with the wire. And by evening the eastern pasture was extended, and both of them were tired in the good way of people who have done useful physical work together, which is a surprisingly intimate kind of tiredness. Rosa Sandoval, when Annie came into town, would give her a look that communicated a complete and detailed awareness of the situation and a thorough approval of it. Clement Brady, the neighbor who had signed the supporting statement for the deed, told his wife that the Monroe widow seemed to be doing fine, which was Brady's version of a comprehensive social observation. What was happening between Annie and Thomas was not hurried. Neither of them was inclined toward hurry. But it was also not cautious in the sense of holding back. It was more that it moved at the pace of things that are real, which is to say that it deepened gradually and continuously, the way good soil develops, layer by layer, until one day you put your hand in it and are surprised by the richness of what is there. The evening in late June when it shifted from something that was understood but unspoken to something that was spoken was an evening that began with supper. Annie had cooked, because she had asked him to stay for supper that Sunday with the ease of someone accustomed to the asking, and he had stayed with the ease of someone accustomed to saying yes. She had made a stew with the vegetables from the garden and cornbread from the iron skillet, and they had eaten at the table as they had done half a dozen times by then, and the conversation had been the particular kind that moves through many things without effort. After supper, they sat on the porch in the long evening light, which at the end of June in New Mexico has a quality of golden duration that feels like a gift. The sky was going through colors above the western hills, and Pearl the milk cow was visible in the near pasture, and the land was doing what land does in the evening, which is exhale and settle. Thomas had his forearms on his knees and was looking at the middle distance in the way he did when he was thinking something through, and Annie was watching the sky and the same middle distance, and after a while he said, quietly and with the plain directness that was his natural mode, "Annie." She turned to look at him. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you're willing." She held his gaze for a moment. There was nothing in his face that was not exactly what it appeared to be, no calculation, no performance. Just Thomas Sawyer in the evening light on her porch, having thought something all the way through and arrived somewhere solid. "I am willing," she said. He let out a breath. She had not realized he was holding it, and the release of it made her smile, and he saw the smile, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it did, which she had come to find one of the more quietly affecting things she had ever observed in a person. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and held it with the same steady, unhurried quality he brought to everything. And they sat like that in the long summer evening until the sky went dark, and the stars came out over the New Mexico territory in their 1,000 numbers. The courting proceeded, as Thomas had said, properly, which in the parlance of 1882 New Mexico meant with intention and respect, and the full awareness of the people around them that something real was underway. He came on Sundays without fail, and often on a midweek evening when the Rafter Cross work permitted. He brought her things, not extravagant things, but considered ones. A seedling peach tree he had found at the San Cristobal nursery, because she had mentioned once that Daniel had wanted to plant one. A book of territorial history from the general store. A good quality oil lamp, because she had mentioned that the one she used for evening reading was not as bright as she would like. She accepted these things with the straightforward appreciation of someone who recognizes the thought behind an object without dramatizing it, and she gave things in return. Meals and conversation, and the particular quality of her attention, which Thomas had come to understand was one of the most generous things she possessed. She listened to him the way he listened to her, with full presence, and in the context of a life that had often been solitary by necessity, this felt like extraordinary abundance. They had discussions. Real ones, not the pleasant surface conversations of people being careful with each other, but the substantive disagreements and negotiations of people who are genuinely different from each other in some ways, and genuinely alike in others, and are in the process of discovering both. They argued, mildly but thoroughly, about the best approach to the herd management on the Monroe land, because Thomas had opinions rooted in 8 years of large-scale ranching, and Annie had opinions rooted in 4 years of intimate knowledge of 60 specific acres. And they were both somewhat right and somewhat in need of what the other knew. They eventually arrived at an approach that was better than either of their original positions, which was a productive argument in the truest sense. They disagreed about the town. Thomas was more inclined to find Dusty Creek's limitations frustrating. Annie had a practical tolerance for the limitations of small places, because she understood that small places, for all their constraints, also contained the kind of human density that meant people looked after each other, at least when they were at their best. The land office morning had not been at the town's best, but the week since had included gestures of quiet support from neighbors and townspeople that meant something to her. In early August, Thomas rode into Dusty Creek on a Tuesday to pick up a supply order for the Rafter Cross and encountered Preston Cole on the boardwalk. Cole had clearly been aware that Thomas and Annie were courting, because word traveled, and Cole had enough intelligence to know that the morning in the land office had been the beginning of something he should take into account. He said nothing directly. He just looked at Thomas with the calculating expression of a man reassessing the pieces on the board, and Thomas looked back at him with an expression that communicated the complete absence of any concern for Cole's calculations. And then Thomas went into the supply store, and Cole went about his business, and they never exchanged a word. It was in that same August that Thomas took Annie to the Saturday dance at the Dusty Creek Community Hall for the first time. The community dances happened roughly monthly and were one of the territory's genuine social institutions, an occasion when the surrounding ranches and homesteads came together in one room with music and the temporary suspension of the week's ordinary labor. Thomas was not a natural dancer in the way that some men are natural, but he was a willing one, and Annie discovered that she was better at it than she had realized, having spent most of her married life too absorbed in the homestead work to attend many dances. They danced together to the fiddle music in the community hall with the particular delight of people discovering something unexpectedly good, and Rosa Sandoval watched from near the refreshment table with the expression of a woman who has been observing this story since the morning in the land office and is satisfied with how it is developing. Clement Brady told his wife, watching from the side of the hall, that Thomas Sawyer was a steady man, which was Brady's version of the highest possible endorsement. It was also at the August dance that Harlan Voss appeared, for the first time in a social setting since the land office incident. He came in the company of his wife, a tired-looking woman named Helen, and he moved through the room with the reduced presence of a man whose authority has been publicly diminished. He did not speak to Annie. He did not speak to Thomas. He found a corner of the room and occupied it with the careful self-containment of someone who is not entirely comfortable, but has decided that absence would look worse than presence. Annie danced with Thomas and did not spare Voss a second glance. She had already won everything she needed to win from that quarter, and she was not a person who wasted attention on concluded battles. The summer moved through its heat and into the relative grace of the New Mexico fall, which came in September with cooling nights and a clarity in the air that made everything look freshly detailed: the hills, the pastures, the sky. On a September evening, sitting on the same porch where the conversation about proper courting had taken place, with the fall air moving in off the hills and Pearl visible in the extended pasture where the new fence stood in the good ground Thomas had helped her set, Thomas said something that he had been building toward for weeks. "Annie," he said, "I would like to ask you something." She turned to look at him. She knew, in the way that you know things when you have been paying close attention to a person for 5 months, what the shape of what he was about to say was going to be. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because of the land or because you need someone to help with the herd or because the territory thinks a woman alone is a problem to be solved. I want to marry you because you are the most decided, thorough, capable, and genuinely good person I have encountered in 32 years of life, and because every Sunday I ride away from this place feeling like I'm going in the wrong direction." Annie was quiet for a moment. The fall air moved. The stars were beginning to come out. "Thomas," she said, "I will marry you. Gladly." He reached over and took her hand the way he had on that first June evening, and then he did something he had not done before, which was lean over and press his lips to the back of her hand in a gesture of such deliberate and sincere tenderness that she felt it in a place below her sternum that had been quiet for a long time and was no longer quiet. They sat there in the fall dark and made no further plans that evening, only sat with the fact of it, which was large enough to fill the evening comfortably. The wedding was in October of 1882, 6 months after the morning in the land office. It was held in the Dusty Creek Community Hall, because it was the largest indoor space available and because Annie, when she thought about a place that meant something in the history of the previous months, kept coming back to the community, the town that had watched her fight and win, the people who had participated in it by knowing and remembering. Rosa Sandoval made the cake. Clement Brady gave Annie away, having been asked, and having accepted with the moved and somewhat uncomfortable gratitude of a man who does not cry easily, but finds himself close to it at this particular moment. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, a gentle man named Reverend Aldrich, who had known both Daniel and Annie during their marriage and who spoke plainly and with genuine warmth about the meaning of building a life with another person in the particular kind of country they all inhabited. Thomas stood at the front of the community hall in his best clothes, which were clean and pressed and somewhat formal by his usual standards, and watched Annie walk toward him with the full attention he brought to everything, and felt a fullness in his chest that was not containable in any word he possessed, so he settled for feeling it without naming it. Annie walked toward him in a dress she had made herself, dark green wool because it was October and because she liked green, and she looked at Thomas and saw in his face everything she needed to see, all the steadiness and the directness and the particular quality of care that she had come to know over the summer months. And she was not nervous in the way that some brides are nervous, but was simply present and glad. They said their vows with the plainness and the weight of people who mean what they say without ornamentation, and when Reverend Aldrich pronounced them married, the community hall erupted in the kind of collective relief and celebration that small communities produce when something good happens to someone who deserves it, which is to say loudly and without restraint. George Avery was there, and he shook Thomas's hand and told Annie, with a sincerity that was slightly embarrassed by its own depth, that he had thought about that morning in the land office many times since. "You were right about everything," he said. "I want you to know I've been reading the statutes more carefully since then." "Good," Annie said, and smiled at him with genuine warmth. The fiddle started up. Thomas danced with his wife with more ease than he had danced at the August gathering, because certainty improves most things, and Annie laughed more openly than she had laughed in a long time, and the October dance at the Dusty Creek Community Hall went on until well past the hour when sensible people should have gone to sleep, which is exactly the right amount of time for a wedding celebration. They went home to the Monroe place that night. Thomas had been gradually moving his few possessions over the previous weeks, the practical preparations of a man who plans ahead without making a fuss about it, and the homestead that had been Daniel and Annie's, and then only Annie's now held the presence of two people again, though differently this time, in the particular way that each life that is built in a house leaves its own quality behind even as the new one begins. They were in November before Thomas proposed the name change question, and he did it with the same plain directness that characterized everything he did. "The deed," he said, "it's in your name. If it stays in your name, it stays clear of any complications. I don't have any interest in putting my name on something you fought to keep." Annie looked at him across the morning table. "You are the first person in my life," she said slowly, "who has ever offered to not have my property." Thomas's expression had a wryness in it. "It is your property," he said. "I just live here now and I'm considerably fond of it." The deed stayed in Annie's name, but the ranch was, in every practical and living sense of the word, theirs. Thomas brought his knowledge of large herd management and applied it to the 60 acres with the attention he would have given 160, and the small herd grew with the careful additions he sourced through his Rafter Cross connections. Annie's garden expanded. The peach tree he had brought her in July was planted along the south fence and was, by the following spring, showing the first signs of serious establishment. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a working winter, the kind of winter that ranges demand. Cold came down off the northern mountains in November and stayed, and the herd required daily attention, the water troughs, the hay, the maintenance of the barn where Pearl and the new additions sheltered against the worst nights. Thomas and Annie worked it together with the efficient coordination of people who have come to know each other's rhythms, the way one person gets the barn ready while the other breaks the ice on the troughs, the way the morning tasks divide without discussion, because the discussion happened in the first few weeks, and now the pattern is just the shape of the day. In the evenings they read. Both of them were readers, which was one of the things that had come out in the early conversations and had mattered quietly ever since. Annie had a small but carefully chosen collection of books, and Thomas had added to it from the San Cristobal bookstore, and the evenings of that first winter had a quality of settled richness that both of them had not previously possessed in their lives. the particular warmth of a cold night outside and good lamplight inside, and another person across the table turning pages. In March of 1883, Annie told Thomas she was expecting a child. He was at the table when she told him, eating the morning meal before the barn work, and the news arrived with a directness consistent with her manner of delivering most news, which was plainly and without delay. He set down his fork. He looked at her. And then he got up from the table and put both arms around her with a gentleness and a completeness that she felt in every part of her, and held on for a long moment without saying anything. And when he finally spoke, it was into her hair, and the word was her name, just her name, said in a way that meant everything else. The pregnancy proceeded through the spring and summer with the robust health of a woman who was accustomed to physical work and outdoor life. Annie did not stop working the land. She adjusted what she was doing as the months advanced, shifting from the heavier tasks to the ones she could manage. And Thomas took on the heavier portions without making an occasion of it, simply doing what needed doing in the way they had always divided the work. Clement Brady's wife, a practical woman named Edith, came by regularly with the particular expertise of a woman who had had 4 children of her own and had opinions about what worked and what did not. Rosa Sandoval sent over food with great regularity, and Annie accepted it with the genuine gratitude of a woman who appreciated good cooking and understood the love behind it. In the June of 1883, while Annie was sitting on the porch in the evening reading, a rider came down the Copper Creek Road with a message for Thomas from the Rafter Cross. The ranch's foreman had taken ill, and the owner, a man named Bauer, was asking if Thomas might consider coming on as foreman on a formal basis, with the associated increase in compensation. Thomas read the message and handed it to Annie. She read it and looked at him. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking it's a fair offer," he said. "The pay would let us add to the herd considerably, and the Rafter Cross is 10 miles. It's not disappearing somewhere." "What does the foreman position require in terms of your time?" she asked. "More than being a hand," he said. "Some weeks considerably more. I'd need to be there for the cattle drives." "How long are the drives?" "Depends. Longest would be 3 weeks. Annie was quiet, her hand resting on the considerable visible evidence of the coming child. "After the baby comes," she said, "we'll have to arrange for Edith to be nearby when you're away for any stretch." "Yes," he said. "Then take the position," she said. "It's good work, and the money will do things for this land that need doing." He looked at her. "I don't want to be gone when the baby is not coming until November," she said. "Edith says November." She gave him the clear-eyed look that he knew meant she had thought it through. "Take the position. We'll manage the rest." He sent his acceptance back with the rider. The boy arrived on a Thursday morning in the second week of November 1883, which was, as Edith Brady later remarked, exactly when she had said he would arrive. And she had been attending births in the territory for 15 years and had never been wrong by more than 3 days. Thomas was at the homestead, having been there since the previous week because no cattle drive in the world was going to take him away from the Monroe place in November of 1883, and Edith was present and capable and calm, and the whole business of it was both more difficult and more transcendent than any of them had adequate words for. Thomas sat by Annie through the labor with the same steady presence he brought to everything, and she was grateful for it in a way that went beyond the practical, grateful for the fact of him being there, for the hand-holding and the quiet voice and the man himself, the specific irreplaceable fact of Thomas Sawyer choosing to be precisely where he was. When it was done and Edith placed the infant in Annie's arms and said, "A boy, strong and good," and Annie looked down at the small face and the small hands, Thomas was beside her, and he was, for the first time in her knowledge of him, completely undone. Not weeping quite, but something very close to it, which was not a thing she had expected from him, and which she found, in that particular exhausted, glorious moment, entirely perfect. They named him Daniel James Sawyer. The Daniel was for the man who had built the foundation, The James was Thomas's father's name. The Sawyer was theirs. Dusty Creek received the news with the warm collective interest of a community that has been following a story for a year and a half. Rosa Sandoval came out to the homestead with food and with what appeared to be genuine emotion. George Avery, when he encountered Thomas in town the following month, shook his hand and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Sawyer," with the particular sincerity of someone who has been peripherally connected to a significant story and feels the weight of having gotten his small part of it right. Clement Brady held young Daniel James and said to Edith, in the tone of a man making a comprehensive assessment, "He is going to be a good one," which was Brady's version of complete and unreserved certainty. The years after Daniel James's birth were the years of building, in the fullest sense of that word. Thomas's foreman work at the Rafter Cross brought in the additional income that let them extend the grazing land, not through purchase, but through a careful leasing arrangement with a neighboring property whose owner had moved to Santa Fe and was glad to have the land managed by someone competent. The herd grew. The garden expanded into what Annie began to call the kitchen garden, a formal name for a growing and deliberate project that supplied not only the Monroe Sawyer household, but, in good seasons, the Dusty Creek General Store. The peach tree bore fruit for the first time in the summer of 1884, and the peaches were, as Thomas later described them to anyone who would listen, beyond what a reasonable person had a right to expect from any tree. Annie, in the autumn of 1884, was approached by a woman from the southern part of the territory, a homesteader's wife named Maria Contreras, who had heard about what Annie had done in the Dusty Creek land office 2 years prior. Maria's situation was similar. Her husband had died, the deed was improperly recorded, and 3 separate parties were pressing claims on the property. She had traveled 4 days to find Annie Monroe, because the story of what had happened in Dusty Creek had traveled farther and faster than Annie had known. Annie sat with Maria at the kitchen table for an entire afternoon, going through the documents Maria had brought, reviewing the relevant statutes, and explaining exactly what steps she had taken and how. She sent Maria home with a hand-copied set of instructions and the relevant statutory citations, and Maria rode back south with something in her posture that had not been there when she arrived. Thomas, when he came in from the barn and found the table still covered in papers and his wife looking thoughtful, sat down and listened to the account. "She'll make it," Annie said. "She has the documents. She just needed to know it was possible." "You could have told her to find a lawyer," Thomas said. "A lawyer told her she didn't have standing," Annie said. "That is the problem with lawyers in these situations. They tell people what they can't do." Thomas looked at her across the table. "You know," he said, "you could make this something more than an afternoon conversation." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you know more about territorial land law than most lawyers in this county," he said, "and you know how to explain it in a way that people can use. And there are a lot of women in this territory who have the same problem Maria Contreras had, and not enough of them know what you know." Annie was quiet for a long moment. Daniel James, 14 months old, was in his crib in the next room making the drowsy sounds of a child settling toward sleep, and the evening was coming in through the windows with its long fall light. "I would need to be more systematic about it," she said slowly. "I would need to get the full statutes in a proper copy, not just the sections I used, and I would need to know the variations, because the land law is different in different parts of the territory." "I know a man in San Cristobal," Thomas said, "who has a printing press and a willingness to help with projects that serve the public interest, assuming the project is presented to him properly." Annie looked at her husband. He was watching her with the warmth and the steadiness and the faint quality of a smile that she had come to know, as well as the lines of her own hands. "You already thought about this," she said. "I have been thinking about it since Maria Contreras rode away this afternoon," he said. "But it is your knowledge and your project. I just have a contact with a printing press." She reached across the table and took his hand. He turned his palm up and held hers. the way he had on that first porch evening with the same steady, unhurried quality. And she thought about the morning in the land office and the pen in her hand and the three lawyers and the deed. And then she thought about everything that had grown from that morning. The summer, the courtship, the wedding in October, the boy in the next room, the peach tree, the extended pasture, the herd, the kitchen garden, the evenings with books and good lamplight. All of it rooted in that morning and in the choice she had made to read until she found the thing that could not be taken from her. "All right," she said, "let's talk to your man with the printing press." The guide that Annie produced over the following winter was not a simple thing, and did not pretend to be. She spent 4 months corresponding with the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, cross-referencing statutes, and writing in the clear and thorough prose of someone who had taught herself to put ideas on paper in a way that other people could follow. Thomas's contact in San Cristobal, a printer named Hector Mendez, was indeed willing, particularly after Annie explained what the guide was for and who it was designed to help. By the spring of 1885, 300 copies of A Practical Guide to Territorial Land Rights for Homestead Families by Monroe Sawyer were printed and distributed through general stores, land offices, and church communities from Dusty Creek to the southern border of the territory. The guide was 12 pages long, written in English and with the assistance of Rosa Sandoval in Spanish as well. It cited the relevant statutes, explained the corrective deed process in step-by-step language, and included a section on what to do if a land office clerk was uncooperative. George Avery received a copy and read it with the expression of a man who is simultaneously impressed and somewhat sobered. He placed it on the counter of the Dusty Creek Land Office, where it remained available to any member of the public who needed it. Harlan Voss, when a copy reached his office by indirect means, read it and said nothing to anyone about it, which was itself a form of acknowledgement. Douglas Whitmore, who had moved on to a larger territory of operations, encountered the guide through a colleague who mentioned that women in the southern portion of the New Mexico Territory were successfully contesting deed errors with increasing frequency. He reportedly remarked that he had not seen it coming. He had, of course, seen some version of it coming since the morning Annie Monroe had cited Section 14 in the Dusty Creek Land Office, but some reckonings take a while to fully arrive. The summer of 1885 brought the second child, a daughter they named Rose Margaret Sawyer, for the peach roses that had begun to climb the south fence, and for Thomas's mother, who had died when he was 14, and who he rarely spoke of but clearly thought about. Rose arrived in July, healthy and entirely certain of her own requirements from the first moments, which made Thomas laugh and Annie declare, with fond exhaustion, that she knew exactly who this child was going to be. Dusty Creek itself was changing in the mid-1880s, as the territory was changing, with the railroad having come through the county seat at San Cristobal in 1884, and the effects of that connection spreading outward. New businesses, new people arriving, the gradual transformation of a frontier settlement into something with more formal infrastructure. Some of what came with this was good. The school in Dusty Creek was properly established in 1885, with a teacher from Ohio who was competent and dedicated, and who, Annie later noted, had clearly read the kind of books that understood education as a matter of opening rather than closing. Daniel James was enrolled the moment he was old enough, and he attended with the focused intensity of a child who has grown up in a house where reading happens every evening and questions are answered with genuine engagement. Thomas, who had not had the opportunity of extended schooling himself, and had taught himself most of what he knew from direct experience, and whatever books came to hand, was moved in a way he did not entirely show by watching his son sit in the schoolroom with a slate and a determination that he recognized as inherited from his mother. Preston Cole had left Dusty Creek by 1885, having found the territory's dynamics less favorable than he had anticipated, and having received a better offer from a law partnership in Albuquerque. Annie did not feel his absence particularly, but she noted it as a data point in the ongoing inventory of how things tend to resolve when they are given time enough to do so. Harlan Voss remained in Dusty Creek, reduced in standing but not in fact, continuing to handle the routine legal work of a small settlement. He and Annie achieved over time the particular relation of people who have been in direct opposition and survived it, which is to say they were civil to each other in the cautious way of people who understand exactly where the lines are and choose to remain on their respective sides of them. She did not forgive him exactly. She also did not carry the grievance as an active weight. She had more important things to carry. Thomas, in the autumn of 1885, was offered the ranch manager position at the Rafter Cross by old Bower, who was getting on in years and whose sons had gone north and east and shown no interest in returning to run the property. It was a significant offer, considerably more substantial than the foreman position, with the understanding that Bower intended eventually to leave the ranch to whoever had managed it well in his final years. Thomas and Annie sat with this for a week, talking it through from every angle in the manner of people who make significant decisions together. The concerns were real. The Rafter Cross was 10 miles north, and the management position would require his presence there in a way the foreman role had not entirely demanded. The Monroe land, their land, would need a hired hand to manage the daily work in his absences. Rose was an infant, Daniel James was 2.5, and the practical requirements of the household were not small, but the opportunity was also real. Thomas had been managing the Rafter Cross effectively for 3 years by that point, and the work suited him in the deep way that work suits a person when it engages everything they are capable of. The financial stability it would bring was not abstract but directly connected to things they both valued: the guide's continued printing, the children's schooling, the land's development. "You are good at it," Annie said, one evening after they had been quiet for a while with the question between them. "You are very good at it, and good work deserves to be done by the people who can do it best." "It will mean I'm away more," he said. "And I have been managing this land without you before," she said. "I will manage it again." She looked at him with the clear amber eyes that he had known now for 3 years. "We are not people who hold each other back, Thomas. That is not what this is." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "Then say yes to Bower," she said, "and let's hire Clement Brady's nephew, who has been looking for work and is apparently very capable, and let's not pretend that the distance is larger than it is." He said yes to Bower. The years that followed were the full years, the years that accumulated into a life with the weight and richness of something that has been genuinely and continuously built. Thomas ran the Rafter Cross with the steady expertise that had always characterized his work, and the ranch thrived under his management in a way it had not quite thrived before, because he brought to it the same quality of thorough attention he brought to everything. Old Bower, who died in the winter of 1888, left the Rafter Cross to Thomas in a will that was clear and well recorded, the kind of deed that left no room for error, and Thomas, when he told Annie, noted with a wry expression that he had been very careful about the paperwork. Annie held his face in her hands when he told her and said, "You deserved it." And then she said, "We will need to think carefully about how to manage both properties efficiently." He laughed, and she laughed with him, because there was always something more to think about, always the next thing to plan and work for, and they were both people for whom that was not a burden but a privilege, the ongoing evidence of a life that had enough substance to require management. The Monroe land and the Rafter Cross operated effectively as a single enterprise by the early 1890s, the Monroe homestead as the domestic center and the original property, the Rafter Cross as the larger commercial operation. They kept the Monroe deed exactly as it was. Annie Monroe Sawyer's property, clearly and correctly recorded, the deed that had started everything in the Dusty Creek land office on that April morning in 1882. Daniel James, growing with the speed that children grow when you are watching carefully and still somehow find surprising, showed by the time he was 7 or 8 a clear aptitude for the things that both his parents had, the precise attention of his mother and the patient knowledge of his father. And he was also developing something that was distinctly his own, a facility with numbers and calculation that made Annie think about possibilities she had not previously considered. Rose, at 4 and 5, was precisely what her arrival had promised, entirely certain of herself and of her requirements, with a vocabulary and a directness that made visitors blink and made her parents exchange the private looks of people who find their children simultaneously exhausting and completely wonderful. She could identify every plant in the kitchen garden by name before she could read, and she had opinions about the milk cow that were coherent and sometimes correct. In 1889, the New Mexico Territory made another step toward the formalization that would lead eventually to statehood, and the land laws were revised in ways that were, on the whole, improvements over the earlier statutes, incorporating more explicit protection for widows and surviving spouses. Annie's guide was cited in the correspondence that preceded the revision, having been passed from hand to hand through the territory for 4 years by that point, its 300 copies considerably multiplied by informal reproduction. She did not know about the citation until George Avery mentioned it to her one morning in the Dusty Creek post office with an expression of considerable satisfaction. She stood in the post office for a moment with the news settling into her. Daniel James was at school. Rose was at home with the capable and now very experienced Edith Brady. Thomas was at the Rafter Cross for the week. The post office was quiet around her, with the particular quiet of a place that transmits connections between people. And she thought about the morning with the 3 lawyers and the pen and the deed. And she thought about all the other mornings that had followed it. And she felt a gratitude so large it was almost physical. A full-body acknowledgement of everything she had been given and everything she had fought for, and the way those 2 things had become, in the end, indistinguishable from each other. She wrote Thomas a letter that afternoon and sent it north to the Rafter Cross. She did not write it about the territorial citation. She wrote it about Daniel James's arithmetic and Rose's opinions about the garden, and the way the late October light came across the eastern pasture that they had extended together 9 years before. She wrote it the way she had learned to write to him over the years, as an extension of conversation, the continuation of the ongoing exchange between 2 people who are each other's primary interlocutor and know it. He wrote back 2 days later from the ranch, in his plain, direct handwriting, about the condition of the herd, and a foal that had arrived that week and the view from the North Ridge in the morning. At the end of the letter, in the space that he always left for the thing he meant most directly, he wrote, "I think about you from the North Ridge when the light is right. I am always, in some way, riding toward you." She read it at the kitchen table by lamplight, with the children asleep and Pearl's successor in the barn and the peach tree's fall skeleton visible through the window, and she held the letter for a long time with her hand flat on the paper as if the warmth from his hand in the writing were still there. When Thomas came back from the Rafter Cross that weekend, he found Annie on the porch despite the October chill, wrapped in a wool blanket with a book in her lap that she was not reading, watching the road the way she watched it when she knew he was coming. He came up the road on his horse in the afternoon light, and she stood from the chair, and he dismounted and came up the porch steps and put his arms around her with the familiar completeness of a long-established embrace, and she leaned into him with the same familiarity, and they stood like that for a while with the fall territory spread out around them, and the sky going its afternoon colors. "The citation," she said into his shoulder. "I heard," he said. He had gotten the letter she hadn't written about it and had heard the news from a different source because in the territory significant things traveled. "You know what I think about that." "Tell me anyway," she said. He pulled back enough to look at her face, holding both her hands in his. "I think you walked into that land office 10 years ago," he said, with nothing but what you knew and what was right, and you made something happen. And then you made it happen for other people too. And now it is in the law. He looked at her with the dark eyes she had known for 10 years and the steady directness that had never once wavered. I do not have words large enough for what I think about that. Yes, you do, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Annie, I have never been prouder of anyone in my life. She held his gaze. He held hers. The evening light was doing what evening light does in New Mexico in October, laying itself across the land in a gold that belongs to no other time of day or season, touching the extended fence, the kitchen garden, the peach tree, the barn where Pearl's successor stood, and the Monroe cattle grazed in the pasture beyond. You handed me the pen, she said. You already knew what to do with it, he said. I did, she said. But I was not certain anyone else was going to see it that way. He brought her hands up and held them against his chest in the way he had learned over 10 years was the most direct physical expression of what he meant. I saw it that way, he said, from the first moment. I know, she said. That is why I let you walk me through that door. The children's voices came from inside the house. Daniel James's at the particular pitch of a 9-year-old, with a considered argument to make, and Rose's at the particular pitch of a 6-year-old who has heard the argument and found it insufficient. Annie and Thomas looked at each other with the private amusement of two people who have spent 10 years accumulating shared references and find new ones arriving daily. We should go inside, she said. We should, he agreed, but did not move immediately, standing in the last of the evening light with her hands in his and the land around them, their land, the land they had kept and built and worked and loved, lying in the fall air as solid and real and entirely theirs as anything could be. They had one more child, a son they named James William Sawyer in the spring of 1892, who arrived with the same robust health as his older brother, and with an expression that Thomas said from the first morning looked like a person who had already formed opinions about the world and would need some time to share all of them. He was not wrong. James William was, from an early age, a force of personality that Daniel James managed with the calm older brother authority of someone who has a thorough and considered older sister, and has therefore been well trained in the navigation of strong characters. The Monroe Sawyer household in the early 1890s was a particular thing, a working homestead that was also a hub of the kind of quiet human significance that does not announce itself, but is felt by everyone who comes into contact with it. The kitchen was where people gathered. Rosa Sandoval still came, though her kitchen garden rivaled Annie's by now, a friendly and ongoing competition that both women maintained with great enjoyment. Clement Brady, now older and slightly less mobile, still sat on the porch sometimes in the evenings and said things that were brief and meant a great deal. George Avery, who had been the land office clerk and was now the land office manager, kept Annie's guide in a prominent place, and had, over the years, become someone who read the statutes carefully and applied them with a scrupulousness that people remarked upon. He credited Annie with the change, not directly to her face, because that would have been too large a thing for him to say easily, but in the way he did his work, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Harlan Voss, by the early 1890s, had retired from practice. He lived quietly in the house he had always lived in with his wife Helen, and when Annie encountered him on the street, they exchanged the civil nod of people who have reached the far side of something. She bore him no active ill will. He had been a man who operated by the rules of a system that benefited men like him, and she had changed the terms of engagement on a particular morning, and the world had continued to turn and life had been built in the space that remained. Douglas Whitmore remained in operation as a land attorney in the territory until 1895, when he retired to California. He became, over the years, somewhat more careful about the cases his firm took involving widows and corrective deeds, which was not an accident. Preston Cole, in Albuquerque, built a successful practice and became, in middle age, something of a proponent of homestead or land rights, which was either genuine conversion or calculated positioning. Annie, when she heard about it, allowed that it was probably both and that both was sufficient. Thomas ran the Rafter Cross into the late 1890s with the same steady excellence that had characterized his management from the beginning. He was well regarded throughout the territory as a man of integrity and genuine competence, and the ranch was, by any measure, one of the better-run operations in the region. He brought his sons out to the ranch frequently as they grew, teaching them what he knew with the patient attentiveness that had always been his mode. And Daniel James took to the cattle work with an interest that was real if not quite singular, because Daniel James had also inherited his mother's inclination toward the law and the records of things, and by his teenage years was already showing signs of wanting to study properly. Annie watched her eldest son's inclinations with the particular attention of a parent who recognizes something in a child that she has some experience with, and she fostered it without directing it, allowing Daniel James to find his own way toward whatever it was going to be. She wrote to the land law publisher in Santa Fe, who had given her the pamphlet she had used in 1882, now a full legal press, and obtained for Daniel James a proper selection of legal texts that he read with the absorbed intensity of a young person who has found a subject that fits the shape of his mind. Rose, by contrast, was the garden and the land manifestly. She had her father's knowledge of terrain and her mother's precise attention, and by 14 she was managing the kitchen garden with a degree of systematic organization that made Annie feel simultaneously proud and slightly outpaced. Rose would not leave the land. That was already clear. She would be the one who stayed and built here, and the thought of it filled Annie with a satisfaction that was also a tenderness. James William, the youngest, was the surprising one, the child who contained both parents' qualities in an arrangement that produced something neither of them had anticipated. He was a storyteller. Not in the frivolous sense, but in the deep sense of someone who gathers the facts and patterns of the world and makes them into accounts that other people can understand. By 10 years old, he was writing things down in notebooks, the events of the ranch and the homestead and the town, and the people in them, and the things that happened to them and what it meant. Annie found one of his notebooks once by accident, left on the kitchen table. She opened it only far enough to see that he was writing about her. About the morning in the land office in 1882, which he knew about from family telling, the way all children know the foundational stories of their families. He had it mostly right, and one detail in particular, the 3 lawyers and the pen and the deed, was rendered with a vividness that stopped her in place. She put the notebook back exactly as she had found it. That evening, when James William came in from the barn, she looked at him across the supper table with the same amber eyes that had looked across the Dusty Creek land office counter 20 years earlier, and she said, "Keep writing." He looked at her. He had Thomas's dark eyes and her jaw, and he was, at 10, already becoming someone specific and real in the way that people become themselves. "You saw," he said. "A little," she said. "Keep writing." He did. The spring of 1899 came in on the Monroe Sawyer land, with the particular quality of springs that mark the end of a decade and the beginning of a new one. Though the land itself did not observe the turning of the century with any special drama, only the usual return of the grasses and the early wildflowers and the peach trees now established and generous blossoming, which had become one of the consistent glories of the eastern fence. Thomas and Annie sat on the porch that spring evening, in the chairs that had replaced the original ones twice over but occupied the same spots, and watched the pasture and the sky with the ease of people whose watching has accumulated into a profound and unremarkable intimacy. Daniel James was in San Cristobal, reading law. Rose was in the barn checking on a new calf. James William was somewhere writing, probably near the north fence where he liked to sit with his notebook when the evening was clear. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked. It was not a question he asked often. He was not a man who needed the silence to be populated with words. but sometimes when they were sitting in the evening he asked because he genuinely wanted to know. "I was thinking about the pen," she said. He looked at her. He knew what pen. He always knew what she meant. "George Avery's pen," she said, "or your pen, whichever it was." "George had it first," Thomas said. "I took it from him to sign as witness." "You handed it back to me after," she said. "When it was done. I don't know why I remember that specifically." "You handed it back even though I didn't need it anymore." Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking at the pasture. "Force of habit," he said. "When someone does something right with a tool, you give the tool back to them." She turned and looked at him in the evening light. This man she had known for 17 years, who had walked across a street in Dusty Creek in the spring of 1882 and kept walking in the same direction ever since. The lines were there now, the years were there, and everything that had accumulated was visible in the way that it is visible in people who have lived fully, in the quality of ease and the depth of presence and the particular way they sit in the world as though they have genuinely earned the right to be there. "I am very glad you were on that street," she said. "So am I," he said. "Were you frightened?" she asked. "When you walked over," he thought about it. "No," he said. "I was interested. There was something happening that was right and I wanted to be near it." "And then," she said. "And then," he said, with the faint quality of a smile she had known for 17 years and still found one of the more affecting things she had ever seen, "I handed you a pen and I became very interested in what you were going to do next, and I have been interested in what you are going to do next ever since." She reached over and took his hand, the way she had on the first June evening on this porch, the way she had 10,000 times since, and he turned his palm up and held hers, the same way he always had, with the same steady, unhurried quality. Rose came out of the barn at a distance, visible against the evening light, moving with the confident stride of a young woman entirely at home in the place she was. James Williams' figure was visible near the north fence, sitting with his notebook. Somewhere in San Cristobal, Daniel James was reading law by lamplight the way his mother had once read land law by candlelight. The peach tree stood in blossom along the south fence, its white flowers open to the last of the light. The Monroe land lay in the evening, correctly recorded and entirely theirs, the deed that Annie had filed on an April morning 17 years ago at the root of everything. The herd, the children, the kitchen garden, the guide in 300 copies, the provision in the revised territorial law. All of it growing from that morning. All of it rooted in the choice to sit down and read until she found what was true and right and could not be taken from her. Thomas held her hand in the evening light, and the land held them both, and the territory stretched away in all directions into the deepening blue of a spring night that belonged, without complication and without qualification, to them.